Hi, my name is Jess and welcome to Jess in Romancelandia, where I talk about romance books and how happily ever afters are what is going to one day topple the patriarchy. Today I'm making a video that I'm super excited about, and that is a review of the Captive Prince trilogy by C.S. Pacat. Pacat, I can't tell if the AT is meant to be like super fancy and unpronounced, so I'm just gonna like be a bit pretentious and try it that way because I think it sounds really cool. So I read this series as part of a reading project of mine, which is basically to read the books that I always see come up on my Tumblr feed. I feel like Tumblr as a social media platform plays a really interesting role in promoting literature and media, particularly when that media involves LGBTQ pairings. If you look at television shows like the Norwegian show Skam, for example, the reason that has the global reach that it does is arguably because of the hype that was generated by the particular kind of fandom debate that exists in Tumblr. I quickly noticed how book series that I don't hear that many people talking about in wider society, such as the Raven Cycle, had massive followings on Tumblr, and so I decided to start a list of books that were very popular on the platform and kind of read Tumblr's own little bookshelf. And one of the first book series to capture my attention was the Captive Prince trilogy, which is a fantasy romance epic that kind of straddles the new adult to adult barrier. When I went into this series, I only knew two things about it. The first one is that it is viewed by many as a foundational text in literature, and the other thing that I knew was that it has generated an unbelievable amount of controversy amongst its fans because of the subject matter, and so naturally I was just super intrigued by it and decided to pick it up. This video is going to be partially spoiler free. I will start with the spoiler free section before I move on into a slightly more spoilery discussion, and I will leave timestamps below so you know what I'm discussing when, in case there are things that you want to get to or things that you would rather miss out on. So to start off with a brief synopsis, Captive Prince follows a man named Damianos, or Damon, of Achelos, who was the heir to the throne of Achelos, which is a kingdom based on ancient Greece and its rituals. Shortly after his father, the king's death, he is betrayed by his older half-brother, who is a bastard of the king, and is sent away disguised as a slave to the enemy kingdom of Vir. In Vir, he is presented as a bed slave to the prince of the country, Laurent of Vir. Very aware of the animosity between his two kingdoms, Damianos knows that he must keep his identity hidden from the prince if he wants to save his own life and also escape from slavery to reclaim his kingdom. It is a slow burn, enemies to lovers story that straddles genres as diverse as fantasy and romance and thriller and political intrigue, and it is one of the most accomplished trilogies I've read in a long time. I want to start this review off with a discussion of the controversy surrounding the book. So like I said, this story begins with Damon being stripped of his title, being stripped of his identity, and becoming a slave in Vir. Both Vir and Achelos are societies that are to an extent built on slavery, particularly sexual slavery. In Achelos, it is just an accepted part of society, whereas in Vir there's also a sort of gendered dynamic to it. So Vir is very interesting in that it is kind of like a homosexual society. Bastardy is treated as the utmost crime, and reproduction is something that's only meant to be very intentional. And the way that the court kind of gets around this is that the general accepted norm is that men take men as lovers and women take women as lovers, and there's this whole system of sexual slavery essentially where they compete to have the best pets. When I first heard that premise, I was both intrigued and terrified. I was intrigued because I thought it was fascinating that C.S. Pacat has created this society where homosexuality is not just the norm, it is the kind of accepted way to do things, and men are more judged for lying with women than they are for lying with men, and vice versa. But I was also terrified because I thought, how is she going to handle the sexual slavery aspect without fetishizing, without trying to excuse such an unforgivable thing? And from what I can see from reviews and the internet, that is where a lot of the controversy comes in. So many people seem to think that because Damon starts the story as a slave, a romance cannot naturally develop from it without it somehow romanticizing that system of slavery. However, having read the book, that is not how I experienced it at all. From my point of view, slavery is not romanticized at all in this book. The book is told from a third person limited, and we spend the vast majority of it inside Damon's head as he is experiencing this system and as he is learning to truly despise the system that he has previously been raised with. The two main characters of this book either start already abhorring the slave system or they kind of have their mindset shifted to an abolitionist point of view by the end of it. Also, a large part of what makes the villains in this story so villainous is that they are perpetuating the slave system, is that they're condoning it, is that consent is something that doesn't matter to them. It is when these characters start to support the system and to uphold the system and to disregard things such as consent that they become immediately hateable. And that's why I think that C.S. Pacat actually does a really good job with such sensitive subject material, because she refuses to romanticize it, and the people that do are shown to be deeply, deeply twisted humans. Furthermore, and for me this was really the bottom line of it all, this is not a romance between a slave and the slave's master. That was what I was really afraid of when reading this book. That cannot be done. You can't do a slave master romance and not have the power dynamics be something so awful and completely twisted. And the romance that develops, the central romance of these books, is not about that. Equality is regularly asserted between the characters as it develops, and nothing truly deeply emotional and romantic happens until that kind of badge of slavery has been lifted. So that is essentially my cup of tea, my pinch of salt when it comes to the controversy surrounding the Captive Prince trilogy. I fully understand that for some people that subject matter is going to be a no-go. I fully respect that. We've all got to protect ourselves when we ingest media, but I also really disagree with the reviewers, or even with the people that just hear the premise of the book and automatically assume that C.S. Pacat is in any way romanticising the system, because in my opinion that's not what she does at all. So moving on into more of a discussion of the book, I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed the perspective that the series is told from. Apart from two scenes, I think, that are from Laurent's perspective, we hear pretty much the entirety of the series in Damon's head. And normally for me, when it comes to third person, I prefer it to jump a little bit more between a few characters. I kind of find it hard sticking with one character for that long with the distance that third person kind of necessitates, but I think it worked incredibly well with this story. Damon is a character who is very assured in his own sense of morality and his own sense of right and wrong. He sees everything as black and white, and because we are as readers in his head, that is how we start seeing the story too. From the beginning of the book, when you have Damon saying this kingdom is good, this kingdom is bad, this person is good, this person is bad, this person is kind to me, therefore they must be good. Because you're in his head, it's so easy to get caught up into those prejudices, and by far the most rewarding part of the trilogy for me is that as this develops and as Damon's perspective shifts, what we think is good and evil, what we think is black and white, slowly breaks down into this just mess of grey. C.S. Pacat has said several times how she essentially wants us to start hating one particular character, hating him in a way that makes him seem completely irredeemable, and then slowly peel back the various layers and reveal the prejudices and biases in Damon's opinion until we understand them as they are, which is two complex, flawed individuals as opposed to hero and villain. I've listened to several interviews of C.S. Pacat and watched several of her commentaries on her writing technique and how she went about crafting the series, and I'm going to link some of my favourites below because she is one of the most well-spoken authors I've ever listened to when it comes to her craft. And it was definitely her writing style that, that made the series just burrow so firmly into my heart. She is really wonderful at saying things without saying them, showing and not telling. There's such a subtlety to her writing. Very little about the characters' emotions or bonds is explicitly stated on the page. It's something that as a reader you have to infer, and there's something about that very gentle kind of unfurling of characterization that is incredibly well done and kept me compulsively reading. C.S. Pacat never says Damon is sad, Laurent is brooding, the relationship between these two characters is slowly shifting. She never explicitly states anything. She just imbues her words and her narrative with these subtleties and nuances that slowly come together and create a really beautiful finished product. The slow burn, oh my god, there is like slow burn in which the characters kind of wait till the end of the book, and then there is slow burn where 3 books are needed to incrementally flesh out a relationship between the two characters, and C.S. Pacat falls into the later category. The relationship build between the two leads is like snail paced, yet it's so well written and so well paced. The developments in their relationship happen so gradually that you can't help but just like scrambling to pick up those pieces as you go along. So this series actually began life as a serial on LiveJournal. The first 2 books were published as serials on LiveJournal before it got picked up by Penguin Publishing, and the 3rd book was published as part of that. And I think that the influence of this serial is pretty obvious in the structure of the first 2, in that every chapter has its own rise and fall and feels very contained. I also think that the serial format had a large impact on the series because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this is a series that doesn't really care for the labels of genre. From my own research and from the books that I read, I think that in publishing sometimes or a lot of the time really, there's kind of this tendency to shoehorn books into a particular genre or category, whereas because C.S. Pacat started off publishing this online with no readership and no expectations, I think that she kind of got to do what she wanted with the first few books. And for this reason, the books just feel so incredibly fresh. Because yes, for me they are a romance, because romance forms the core of it, and it is the development of the romance that really helps to drive the plot. But it is also a fantasy novel. It's set in 2 fantasy kingdoms, and there is some aspects of political intrigue in there. And whilst in many ways it can be seen as kind of a coming of age in a way of the characters, both are adult men when the story starts. So it's really, really interesting how I think the serial format meant that C.S. Pacat was able to craft something that's so unlike anything I've ever read. I've honestly never read something that reminds me of Captive Prince. Another thing I wanted to touch on was the humour. This is a dark series, as you can probably guess from the subject matter, and I wasn't expecting it to be so funny, but I think something about the kind of sparseness, kind of restrained nature of her writing means that when these like little sarcastic barbs pop out, particularly from characters such as Laurent and Nicaise, it's a shock, and it's really, really funny. I think she balances pathos and banter and humour really, really well, and I never feel like the mood of a scene is off. She's really great at creating and sustaining tension and creating and sustaining atmosphere, even when humour comes in and could potentially derail that. I feel like I should also talk about the weaker points of this series for me, which honestly there was not many. I think a lot of people have spoken about and criticised the fact that there are hardly any female characters in this series. I'd rather criticise the series for things that it did do wrong rather than for things that weren't in there, but I did get kind of annoyed at how when women do crop up they are a little bit flat and one-dimensional, but C.S. Pacat kind of makes up for that a little bit in the last book with the way that she takes certain arcs. So that isn't a major complaint of mine, but I do understand people that are very frustrated with how masculine this series is. There's very little feminine presence within it. I also think that the villains, whilst I love to hate them, were not as well fleshed out as our 2 main characters. A lot of the main characters and a lot of the secondary characters feel incredibly 3-dimensional and interesting, and their motives are constantly shifting and changing and interconnecting. But for me, the sort of big bad of the series and then his main henchmen lacked very little substance. They were kind of just evil, and I don't know, I almost wanted them to have a little bit more complexity to them than that. I think if you're someone who looks for good villains, this might be a hit or miss for you, because on the one hand they are wonderful characters to hate and they are truly despisable people, but on the other there's not as much depth to them as there is to the protagonists of the series. So that is pretty much all I can say without spoilering you for the rest of the series. So if you guys haven't read the Captive Prince trilogy, I would recommend clicking away now and coming back. As kind of a final word to you, I adored this series. I think it is expertly written, wonderfully crafted, and just has one of the most satisfying romantic arcs I've ever read. If you're someone who loves romance, who loves fantasy, who loves books that push at the boundaries of both genre and content, then this is the one for you, honestly. So, moving into the spoilery territory, I will say something that surprised me with this book is how many of the twists I saw coming, and that isn't like a brag. I'm just as shocked at anyone that I saw it coming. I see nothing coming either. Game of Thrones with me was just literally shock after, you know, Ned Stark's head rolling in the dirt shock. But I know from researching and from reading reviews that I wasn't the only one who picked up on several of these things, and this makes me wonder whether it was kind of an intentional move on C.S. Pacat's behalf, because I feel like a lot of the big twists of the story you as a reader pick up on, but because Damon doesn't until the very last book, that kind of means that the tension is still there, because even though you as a reader know, you feel almost more tense because you know that Damon doesn't know yet. So with the Regent's abuse of Laurent, that was something that for me became very clear towards the end of the book, when he has that awful, like, chills down your spine line about Laurent being a beautiful boy. I was really surprised that Damon took as long to work that one out as he did, and it made for that heartbreaking scene at the Kingsmeet in the final book. I also personally felt that it was obvious from the outset that Laurent knew who Damon was. His reaction of kind of white-faced horror, the fact that he knows that Damon has the scar that Damon caught at Marlis, where obviously Damon killed Laurent's brother August. Pronunciation is not my strong suit, guys. I don't know, those were two things that were really big twists in book 3 when they were revealed, but I think were not particularly hidden by the author in the narrative, but like I said, this worked for me because Damon is so oblivious to Laurent's past and the fact that Laurent knows his true identity, and I strongly believed in my two theories about those things. Like I said, it made it more rewarding because I was almost more on edge waiting for Damon to put the pieces together than I would have been if I was still trying to put the pieces together myself. And I think it's incredibly clever and a really, really good use of the biased narrative viewpoint. Something I did not see coming was Amaric's betrayal. Oh my god, that scene was like a two-fisted punch in the face, because first of all you had the fact that Amaric betrayed everyone and my darling George, who is probably like one of my favourite secondary characters of the whole thing, and then when Laurent explains Amaric's reasons for why and reveals that Amaric is also a victim of the Regent's abuse, yet has fallen for that very man. Oh my god, like I went from wanting to punch Amaric in the face to wanting to just give him a hug to just not knowing what to do with myself. It was incredibly well done, and I have read the short story that is about Amaric and George, and that almost reinforced the tragedy for me, so if you guys want to cry for like a few hours, check that out. The sex scenes I thought were incredibly well done and not gratuitous. A lot of the reviews paint this as an erotic series, and whilst there is obviously a homoerotic subtext kind of woven throughout the whole thing, I didn't think that the sex scenes between the two leads were at all gratuitous. When I mentioned some of the videos that I have watched on C.S. Pacat's craft, the one that I'm particularly thinking of is her DVD commentary on chapter 19 of Princess Gambit, which is the first sex scene between Laurent and Damon, and in it she talks about how she wanted that scene to feel so incredibly intimate and personal that as a reader you almost don't want to read it, and for me that was the case with all of their sex scenes. Whilst of course as a reader and as a thirsty hoe I wanted them to have that aspect of their relationship consummated, there was also something about each moment that they were together intimately in that way that was almost too much for me, that made me not want to look, because C.S. Pacat was so good at kind of using those sex scenes as a way of really kind of testing the waters of their relationship, as revealing really key aspects of both their characters and their dynamic together. So I thought it was really, really well done. I'm not a huge fan of gratuitous sex scenes. For me, they do need to either push the plot forward or an aspect of character development forward for them to really hold my attention, and this trilogy definitely does that and manages to be hella romantic at the same time. So nice one C.S. Pacat. The ending to Kings Rising was a little bit sudden. I wasn't a huge fan of that because, like, I didn't know if Damon was gonna survive. I was very confused about Laurent kind of chaining him to the thing. I liked the parallel of it, of Laurent killing Damon's brother as Damon had killed his. I thought that brought their arcs together in a very nice way, but for me the novella that follows King's Rising, The Summer Palace, was really needed for me to gain closure over the series. I'm not generally someone that needs a nice epilogue saying, yeah, they got together and had beautiful blonde babies, but I do need to know that the characters have like survived. So yeah, for me the ending of King's Rising would have been weaker if it hadn't been for the fact that I already knew that C.S. Pacat had this novella that she was kind of positioning as the epilogue to the series. What else did I love? Oh, I loved the random moments throughout this when they're just so attracted to each other, because it's such a reluctant attraction that it cracked me up every time. Like, one moment that I keep coming back to is in Prince's Gambit, where they can't get out of that room, and so Damon just like grabs the window grill and rips it out of the plaster with his bare hands, and Laurent is just speechless and staring at him like, man got muscles. I love when Laurent is wearing the chieftain and Damon just full out drops a jug and it smashes everywhere. That cracked me up. Just the way that they are so clumsy with negotiating their attraction to each other was absolutely hilarious to me, because these two men are like political heavyweights, yet they like get together and they get so flustered and they have these crushes, and it was just such an adorable contrast. As much as I love them as a duo, some of my favourite moments were actually when Laurent and Damon had to kind of interact as part of wider groups, because it was kind of like they were playing up their characters even more. When they were in front of people, it was like Laurent became even more like sassy blonde bitch and Damon became even more like honourable, strong, silent man. It cracked me up so much. I loved the scene with Charles, the Venetian cloth merchant, where Laurent pretends to be this man so he can get past the guard, and then he points at Damon and is like, this is Layman, my assistant. It was just so funny to watch them step into those roles in kind of a comedic setting. I'm gonna see if I can find the quote, because it was comedy gold. So basically, after Laurent says that he is Charles, they bring out the real Charles, who knows who Laurent is but wants to have his back, and this is the exchange that is had. Charles took one look at the unmistakable blue eyes and blonde hair of his prince, who he had last seen in Damon's lap, dressed as a pet in a tavern in Nessun. His eyes widened. Then, with a truly heroic effort, "Charles!" said Charles. "If he is Charles, then who are you?" said the officer to Charles. "I am," said Charles. He is Charles. I have known him these 8 years," said the innkeeper. "That's right. He is Charles. I am Charles. We're cousins," said Charles gamely. "Named after our grandfather. Charles." Hilarious stuff. It was so good. It was so good. And there were so many moments like that. Moments like when Laurent got drunk and kind of acted a bit of the lad with Macadon, and then only trusted Damon to see him in that kind of vulnerable way. Yeah, as much as I love them together and as individuals, kind of watching them try and negotiate their relationship in a more public setting was also incredibly rewarding and at times genuinely funny. So to kind of round things off, I'm going to talk a little bit about my favourite scene in each book, and then my favourite major and minor character. So my favourite scene in Captive Prince is just after Laurent has been attacked and Damon has saved his life, when Damon goes to run off and Laurent, who is drug weakened, who is still in shock, says to Damon that he shouldn't go, because if he goes now it's an admission of Damon's guilt and Laurent will not be able to protect him. And Damon is just completely baffled at the idea that Laurent, who has treated him abominably, like, would want to protect him. And for me that was such an important moment, because it's where you see that Laurent actually has this very, very keen sense of right and wrong and justice and honour and morality. And I think for me that was when I was completely certain that we were going to get that, not even redemption arc, but deeper understanding of Laurent, because for someone with that level of integrity to have done the awful things that he did to Damon, you know that there's something bigger at play there, and I just thought it was a really, really clever scene. In Prince's Gambit there are so many scenes that I want to say, because this is really where their romance blossoms. I want to say chapter 19 because I'm bringing sexy back. I want to say the kiss on the battlements, I want to say the rooftop chase. There are so many amazing, amazing scenes, but for me the best one is when they are in the tent, I believe, and Laurent says that the reason that Yocast chose Castor, Damon's brother, is because Castor is the weaker man and is easier to control. This leads Damon to ask him, why would you say that? You don't even know Castor. And Laurent says, I'm coming to know you. And there was just something so beautiful about that acknowledgement of the evolution of their relationship that makes it my favourite moment of that book. And then as for King's Rising, for me, my favourite scene in that was the sword fight between them, because I think even though it was a very emotional and very difficult and very angry scene, they needed to kind of like have at it. They needed to sort of shared their anger and their betrayal with each other, for them to be able to move on as a couple, and there was just something so unbelievably cathartic about that scene. And yeah, so that was my favourite scene. That, and also Laurent just like casually like hanging around the tent like hello lover when Damon shows up, because the drama of that scene. So favourite characters, my favourite major character, I did love Damon. I feel like Damon is often written off as kind of like that lovable oaf stereotype. That's not how I experience him at all. I actually think he's quite intelligent, he just has really shit luck. But for me, Laurent is my favourite main character, probably because of the way that he's revealed to us so slowly, bit by bit. I think is really wonderful. And my favourite minor character is Yocast. I wasn't expecting for C.S. Pacat to go the way that she did with her in the end, when you kind of have more of Yocast's motives revealed to you, and you realise that she did what she did to save Damon's life, not out of, you know, a sense of betrayal or because she loved Castor. I thought that that added a really nice nuance to her character, although I also love Nicandros, just because every scene that he's in, he gives off such I am done with this energy that I relate. So yeah, those are kind of all my thoughts, feelings, gushings, emotions on the Captive Prince trilogy. If you guys haven't read it, please do, it's wonderful. But until next time, thank you so much for watching this review, and goodbye!